No mail-order bride lasted 1 week with the mountain man, until the obese one refused to leave. In the rugged Montana wilderness, far beyond the last trading post, lived Silas Boone, a man as rough and silent as the land itself. The nearest townfolk spoke his name with both fear and awe, the mountain man of Bear Valley. Now let's dive into this interesting story. The wind blew down from the northern mountains, sharp enough to bite through a man's coat and whisper through the cracks of every building in Birch Hollow. It was a lonely little town, half a dozen weather-worn homes, a saloon that never slept, and a post office that leaned against the cold like an old man with bad knees. Inside that post office, folks huddled around the stove, trading stories and gossip to pass the endless winter hours. Old Hank Cooper, the postmaster, was sorting through a small stack of letters when he froze. His bushy brows drew together as he squinted at one envelope, its edges still dusted with frost. The name written on the front made the room go quiet. Silas Boone. The mountain man. The very name stirred something between awe and fear in every soul there. Boone's got himself another letter, Hank muttered, tapping the envelope against his palm. A woman near the stove scoffed. Another? Ain't no woman with sense would head up that ridge after what happened to the last one. A ranch hand chuckled, spitting into the fire. 3 brides in 1 year and not a one lasted a week. First one ran crying, second near froze to death, third took the supply horse and didn't look back. Can't say I blame him, another added. That man's half bear, half ghost. Hank opened the letter, curiosity overcoming caution. The handwriting was neat but firm. The name signed at the bottom was Clara Mae Hensley. She's on her way, he said softly. And she don't sound the type to scare easy. The room filled with murmurs. Someone whispered, she'll never make it through 1 week. But they were wrong. Clara Mae Hensley stepped off the stagecoach 3 days later, her boots sinking into the slush of Birch Hollow's Main Street. She wasn't what the townsfolk expected. She wasn't young. She wasn't dainty. And she wasn't timid. At 32, Clara Mae had lived through more than her share of storms, some of them the kind that didn't come with wind or rain. Her figure was soft and round, her hands work-worn, her heart stitched together by years of whispered ridicule and lonely nights. But there was a quiet strength in her step, the kind that comes from surviving what others think should have broken you. The stagecoach driver helped her down, hesitating. Ma'am, you sure you're heading up that way? Ain't nothing past the ridge but wolves, snow, and that Boone fella. Clara lifted her chin, clutching her carpet bag. Then I'm heading the right way. The driver just shook his head, muttering as he climbed back onto the coach. All around her, people paused to stare. Some snickered softly, thinking she couldn't hear. She's too big for that trail. Won't last a night up there. Boone'll scare her off before she unpacks her bag. But Clara ignored them all. She'd been stared at her whole life, by men who laughed and women who pitied her. She'd learned long ago that pity was just cruelty dressed up to look kind. She walked straight to the general store, bought flour, coffee, beans, and a lantern, and wrapped herself in a wool shawl that smelled faintly of cedar. Mrs. Dunning, the storekeeper, watched her curiously as she tied her bundle. You're heading up the mountain, ain't you? Yes, ma'am. Then you be careful, the older woman warned softly. Silas Boone don't keep company long. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe he just never had the right company. By dusk, the snow had started again, light at first, then heavier, falling in thick, silent flakes. Clara hired a young guide, Tommy Dyer, to lead her up part of the trail before nightfall. They rode in silence for a while, hooves crunching through the ice-crusted path. Finally Tommy said, most folks turn back by Eagle Pass. Ain't no one goes higher this time of year. Then I suppose I'll be the first, Clara replied, steady as ever. The boy gave her a doubtful look but said nothing more. When they reached the ridge, he stopped his horse. Cabin's a mile up from here. Follow the smoke if you see it. That's Boone's place. She thanked him and went on alone. The climb was slow, grueling. The wind whipped through the trees, clawing at her shawl. Snow crept into her boots, her fingers went numb, and still she pressed forward. Each step sank deep into the white, her breath coming in small, determined clouds. Once she stumbled and fell to her knees, the weight of her bag dragging her down. For a moment she just stayed there, breath ragged, heart pounding, body aching. She could turn back. No one would blame her. But the thought of returning to that empty boarding house in Kansas, where she'd been poor fat Clara all her life, made her grip her bag tighter. She stood, brushed the snow from her skirts, and whispered to the night, I didn't come this far to quit now. The mountain wind howled in response as if testing her resolve. By the time she saw the cabin, the sky was black and full of snow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, proof that someone was home. She climbed the last few steps and knocked, her hand trembling from cold. The door opened and there he was. Silas Boone filled the doorway like a shadow made of muscle and flannel, tall, broad, his beard thick and his eyes dark and unreadable. The firelight behind him made him look more legend than man. For a heartbeat neither spoke. Then he said in a low, gravelly voice, "You're late." Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "The mountain slowed me, but I made it." He stared for a long moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. Before the wind eats you alive." The cabin was sparse. One chair, one bed, one table. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. "You can leave your things there," Silas said, nodding toward the wall. She did, then turned toward him. "You live here alone?" "Always." "Well," she said, glancing around, "it could use a woman's touch." He grunted. "Don't need one." Clara smiled softly. "Then you won't mind if I tidy a bit." He didn't answer. Just went back to the fire, staring into it like it held all the answers the world had ever denied him. She moved quietly through the cabin, wiping the table, stacking the firewood, folding a blanket that had been tossed carelessly across the bed. When she finally sat down, tired but content, Silas spoke without looking at her. "Why'd you come?" "Because you asked." "I didn't expect anyone to answer." She met his gaze then, calm and unwavering. "I reckon most folks don't expect much from people like me." "That's their mistake." The silence that followed was long and heavy, but not cold. The kind of silence that fills a room when two lives are just beginning to circle the same flame. Outside, the snow thickened, wrapping the mountain in white. Inside, the fire crackled, warming the cabin, and two hearts that didn't yet know how much they needed the other. And that was how it began, not with flowers or promises, but with a storm, a stubborn heart, and a mountain man who'd never met a woman brave enough to stay. Morning broke pale and bitter across Bear Valley, sunlight glancing off endless fields of snow. The world outside was white and silent, save for the distant groan of trees bending under the cold. Inside the cabin, warmth clung faintly to the air. The fire had burned low through the night, and Clara Mae woke to find the room dim, her breath rising in small clouds. Silas was already up. He moved like a shadow, big, quiet, sure, adding wood to the fire before stepping outside without a word. Through the frosted window, she watched him chop wood. Each swing of his axe was deliberate, like he was trying to split more than just logs. He worked without pause, muscles moving beneath his wool shirt, his breath steaming in the air. Clara's fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. He was unlike any man she'd ever known, carved from the same wildness that surrounded him. The kind of man who didn't ask for company because he'd stopped believing he deserved it. Still, she rose and began her day. The kitchen corner was small and dusty, a single shelf of tin cups and a few sacks of flour. She found a dented kettle and filled it with snow, setting it near the fire to melt. Then she found beans, a little salt pork, and started breakfast. By the time Silas returned, his boots tracked snow across the wooden floor, his beard frosted at the edges. He paused when he saw her at the stove. "You didn't have to do that," he said flatly. Clara didn't look up from stirring the pot. "I know." He grunted. "Then why?" "Because we both gotta eat, don't we?" That silenced him. He hung his coat, washed his hands, and sat down without another word. The smell of hot beans filled the cabin, thick and comforting. When she set the bowl in front of him, he muttered a quiet, "Thank you." Clara sat across from him, her own bowl in her hands. The table was small and their knees nearly brushed beneath it. Silas ate like a man and used to sharing his meals. Quick, guarded. Each motion neat and restrained. After a long silence, Clara said, "How long have you lived up here?" "Too long." "You ever think about leaving?" He looked up then, his dark eyes unreadable. "And go where?" "Anywhere. Back to town maybe." He gave a dry laugh, more like a growl. "Town's full of talk. Up here there's quiet." "I prefer quiet." Clara smiled faintly. "Quiet's good, but it gets lonely." His gaze lingered on her face a little longer than before. "I manage." The day stretched slow and silent. After breakfast, Silas went to mend a snare lying down by the creek, leaving Clara to herself. She spent the hours sweeping dust from corners, scrubbing the floor, patching a tear in the curtain that flapped in the wind. Each small act made the cabin feel a little more like a home, and a little less like a fortress. When she found an old photograph tucked beneath the mantel, a faded image of a younger man with a woman and child, she set it upright again, dusted the frame, and whispered, "There. You belong back in the light." When Silas returned that evening, snow in his beard and a rabbit hanging from his belt, he noticed. His eyes flicked to the photograph, then to her. "You touched my things." Clara didn't flinch. It was face down in the ashes. Figured that wasn't any place for family. A muscle worked in his jaw. "They're gone." "I figured that too." He said nothing more, but the storm in his eyes softened. Just a little. That night, the wind howled against the cabin like a living thing. The shutters rattled and the pine logs creaked under the weight of snow. Silas sat by the fire, carving a small piece of wood with his knife, a habit born from long winters. Clara mended a torn sleeve beside the lamp. The light flickered, painting them both in warm gold. After a while, she spoke softly. "Back home they used to say no man stays kind when the cold gets mean. I'm starting to think they were wrong." He didn't look up. "You don't know me. I know enough. You could have turned me away last night." "I thought about it." She smiled faintly. "But you didn't." For a long moment, only the crackle of the fire filled the air. Then he said, almost to himself, "You won't last." "I've heard that before," she said, threading her needle. "But I'm still here." Silas set down his carving, leaned back and studied her. There was no fear in her, not in her eyes, not in her posture, not in the quiet way she went about making the cabin warmer than it had been in years. "You're not like the others," he said finally. Clara glanced up. "No, I'm not." The next morning she woke early to the sound of ravens outside. The world was white and still, the snow deep and glittering under pale sunlight. She pulled on her shawl and stepped out onto the porch. The cold bit through her, but the view took her breath away, endless ridges, silver rivers frozen midstream, and the cabin sitting like a heartbeat in the wilderness. For the first time in years she felt something fierce stir inside her, belonging. Silas joined her a few minutes later, stepping up beside her with his coffee cup steaming. They stood in silence, side by side, two figures against the mountain morning. "You don't have to stay," he said, not unkindly. Clara looked at him, eyes steady. "And you don't have to be alone. Yet here we are." He didn't reply, but when he turned to go back inside, there was something different in his step, like a man trying to remember how it felt to have someone near. That night, as the fire crackled low, Clara thought of the letters she'd written before this one, to men who never answered. Men who'd promised things they never meant to keep. But Silas Boone wasn't one of those men. He hadn't promised her anything. And maybe that was why she trusted him more than all the rest. He was hard and quiet, scarred by loss, but beneath it all, there was something kind. Something that didn't know how to show itself yet. She lay down, listening to the wind outside, and whispered a small prayer into the darkness. "Lord, help me stay. Even when he pushes me away. Especially then." And outside, the mountain sighed, cold, endless, and patient, as if it knew she was the one who wouldn't leave. The days passed quietly on Bear Valley Ridge, one melting into another beneath the pale winter sun. Snow blanketed everything, the pines, the cabin roof, even the small creek that now whispered faintly under a layer of ice. Inside, Clara Mae kept busy. She cooked, cleaned, and found comfort in the rhythm of small, ordinary things. The cabin, once gray and cold, began to breathe again, the air warmer, the hearth always glowing, the table never bare. Silas Boone didn't know what to make of it. He'd lived years in silence, his only company the wind, his own shadow, and the ghosts of memory. Now this woman hummed while she worked, moved his things around, filled his home with smells he hadn't known since before the war. He tried to ignore her, but she was like the mountain itself, steady, unmoving, impossible to drive away. One morning he came in from checking traps, his boots heavy with snow. Clara was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a stubborn flame to life. Her cheeks glowed from the heat, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered. "You'll catch your death if you keep going out before daylight." "I've survived worse," he muttered, stomping off the snow. "Survived maybe," she said, standing, "but that ain't the same as living." He frowned. "And what would you know about that?" Clara smiled softly. "Plenty." She handed him a mug of coffee, strong, black, steaming. For a moment their fingers brushed. He flinched at the contact, like he wasn't used to the warmth of another person's touch. He took the cup without a word and sat down at the table. The silence between them grew thicker each day, but it wasn't unfriendly. It was something else, like two storms circling each other, unsure if they'd clash or blend. Clara didn't push him to talk. She learned his rhythms instead, how he always checked the traps before dawn, how he sharpened his knife after supper, how he paused at the old photograph above the hearth when he thought she wasn't looking. She learned that he wasn't cruel, only guarded. His silence was armor, not arrogance. And though she'd been laughed at all her life for being too large, too plain, too much, here on this mountain none of that mattered. The snow didn't judge. The fire didn't sneer. Even Silas, for all his rough edges, never looked at her the way men back home did. He looked at her like he was trying to understand how she kept going. After nearly 2 weeks, Clara realized something strange. He was testing her. When she rose early to start breakfast, he'd already gone to the woods, leaving her to shovel the path alone. When she fixed the loose shutter, he waited until the wind knocked it loose again before silently repairing it himself. When she sang softly while kneading bread, he'd stomp out to the porch, only to stand there listening through the crack of the door. She saw through every bit of it. And one evening, when the wind rattled the cabin and Silas came in dripping snow, she finally said it aloud. "You keep trying to find the thing that'll make me run." He froze mid-step. "What?" "You test me," she said calmly, drying her hands. "You bark orders, you scowl, you work me near to exhaustion, waiting for me to pack up and go like the others." He didn't answer. Clara took a deep breath. "But you're wasting your time, Mr. Boone. I didn't come here for comfort. I came here for a man who meant what he wrote." Her words hung in the air, warm and solid. Silas stared at her for a long time, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then he muttered, "You think I'm some kind of monster, don't you?" "No," she said softly. "I think you're a man who's been hurt enough to build walls higher than the mountains themselves." That silenced him completely. The storm outside grew worse that night. The wind howled down the chimney like a wild thing and snow piled thick against the door. Silas sat by the fire, carving another piece of wood, his hands steady, his eyes distant. Clara mended one of his shirts nearby, needle flashing in the lamplight. After a long while he spoke quietly. "You know why the others left?" She shook her head. He hesitated. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, he said, "Because I told them to." Clara looked up from her sewing. "I didn't want them here. Didn't want to watch them hate the mountain, or pity me. So I made it easy for them to go." "And me?" she asked softly. He met her eyes then. "You just won't take the hint." A small smile curved her lips. "You're right about that." Something almost like a laugh escaped him, quick, disbelieving, gone as soon as it came. By morning the storm had calmed. The snow lay deep and unbroken, glinting like silver under the weak sun. Silas stepped outside with his rifle, scanning the tree-line. "Elk tracks," he said absently. Clara followed him out, wrapping her shawl tighter. The air was crisp and biting, but her cheeks glowed with life. He turned to her, his expression softening just a little. "You don't belong here," he said not unkindly. She smiled faintly. "That's what the world's been telling me my whole life, Mr. Boone. But I stay where I'm needed." For a moment, something shifted in his face, the hard lines easing, the shadow in his eyes lifting just enough to let a glimmer of warmth through. He didn't reply. Instead, he handed her his knife. "If you're staying, you'd best learn to carve. Mountain winters are long." Clara took the knife, surprised, and smiled. "Then you'd best start teaching me." That evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara sat beside him, clumsy fingers working over a block of pine while Silas guided her hand. Their shoulders brushed and neither pulled away. The cabin that once echoed with silence now hummed with life, the soft scrape of a blade, the low rumble of his voice, her quiet laughter. Outside, the mountain slept under a blanket of snow. Inside, something thawed, something fragile and human that neither of them had felt in years. Silas Boone, the man who'd sent 3 women fleeing down the mountain, realized he didn't want this one to leave. And Clara Mae, the woman the world had called too much and not enough all her life, realized she'd finally found the one place she didn't have to change a thing. In the heart of Bear Valley, a gruff mountain man and a stubborn woman sat beside a flickering fire, 2 souls, both scarred and lonely, beginning to learn the quiet language of staying. The first real blizzard came 2 weeks later. It rolled over the northern ridge like a white beast, the kind that swallowed whole cabins and turned the world into endless silence. The wind screamed through the pines. Snow fell so heavy it erased everything but the faint orange glow from Silas Boone's cabin window. Inside, the storm sounded like the mountain itself was angry. The shutters shook and frost crept across the glass like thin white fingers. Clara was stirring a pot of rabbit stew over the fire when Silas came in from outside, his coat frozen stiff, snow clinging to his beard. "Traps'll be buried by morning," he muttered, shaking the snow from his hat. "Ain't no moving in this weather. We're stuck here." She glanced at the window, the world beyond already invisible. "Then we'll make do." Her calm tone made him look up. He'd expected panic or complaint, the kind the other brides had shown when the snow trapped them in for days. But Clara just wiped her hands on her apron and ladled stew into 2 bowls. "You sit," she said firmly. "You'll freeze solid if you don't eat." Silas hesitated, then sat. The smell of stew filled the cabin. Wild herbs, meat, and something sweet she'd added without telling him. He tasted it and something in his expression softened. "You used honey." She smiled faintly. "A touch. Found the jar behind your flour sack. Figured it had been waiting long enough to be useful." He grunted, pretending to disapprove, but he kept eating. That night the wind grew worse. The cabin groaned under the weight of snow pressing against the roof. Silas checked the beams twice, pacing like a restless bear. Clara watched him quietly, sewing by lamplight. "You can't stop the storm, Silas," she said gently. "You just have to wait it out." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "You speak like you've seen worse." "I have," she said softly. "Storms don't always come from the sky." Their eyes met, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He didn't ask what she meant, and she didn't offer more. By morning the storm had buried the cabin nearly to the windowsills. They spent the day conserving firewood and repairing the roof from inside. Silas showed her how to pack snow along the walls to keep the cold out. She helped, clumsy at first but determined. When her fingers went numb, he took her hands in his, large, calloused, rough, and rubbed warmth back into them without a word. She blinked at him, surprised by the gentleness behind his strength. "Can't have you freezing to death," he said roughly, letting go too quickly. "Of course not," she teased lightly. "You'd miss my cooking." He gave a low huff that might have been a laugh, small but real. That evening the wind howled and the fire burned low. The cabin's walls creaked like old bones. Clara wrapped herself in a quilt and tried to sleep, but the cold bit through the fabric. Silas sat near the fire, sharpening his knife, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. She was shivering, though she tried not to show it. Finally, with a muttered curse, he set the knife down and grabbed another blanket. He crossed the room and held it out. "You're gonna turn blue if you keep pretending you're fine." Clara hesitated. "And what about you?" "I've been through worse," he said simply. Still, when she took the blanket, he didn't go back to his chair. He stayed standing beside her for a moment, as if debating something in silence. Then he sat down across from her, closer than before. They didn't speak. The firelight flickered over their faces, hers soft, his weathered, and for the first time neither looked away. Outside the mountain raged. Inside it was quiet. And in that quiet, a fragile kind of peace settled between them, like the calm at the eye of a storm. The next morning Clara woke to the sound of chopping. Silas was outside, splitting wood in the frozen dawn. She threw on her shawl and stepped out to help, ignoring the cold that clawed at her cheeks. "You'll hurt your back swinging like that," she called. He looked up, surprised to see her. "You shouldn't be out here." "Neither should you," she said, reaching for another log. He frowned. "You don't know what you're doing." "Then show me." He stared for a moment, then handed her the axe. "Fine. Don't lose a finger." She tried, truly tried, but the first swing barely nicked the log. The second one bounced, nearly hitting her boot. Silas's bark of laughter echoed through the cold air. It startled them both. Clara froze, the axe halfway up. "What's funny?" she demanded. "You," he said, still grinning. "You look like you're wrestling a mule." Her lips twitched. "Maybe I am." "Here," he said, stepping behind her. "Like this." He placed his hands over hers, guiding the axe down in one clean motion. The log split neatly in two. Their breath mingled in the cold. The moment stretched, heavy, close. Then he stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "Not bad," he muttered. Clara smiled. "You're a good teacher." He grunted, pretending not to be pleased. That night, after supper, she found him sitting by the fire with a small wooden carving in his hand. A bird, delicate and unfinished. "You made that?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Used to carve with my pa." Before, he trailed off. Clara didn't press him. She just sat beside him, close enough to see the care in each line of the carving. "It's beautiful," she said simply. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time there was no guardedness in his eyes. Only quiet gratitude. As the days passed, the storm began to ease. But something inside the cabin had shifted. Silas no longer moved like a man waiting for someone to leave. And Clara no longer felt like a woman proving she belonged. They worked side by side, fixing snares, tending the fire, even laughing sometimes. The mountain still loomed wild and cold beyond their door, but inside, warmth had found its home. And one night, as the snow finally stopped and stars glittered through the clearing clouds, Silas looked at her across the firelight and said quietly, almost shyly, "You're tougher than you look, Clara Mae." She smiled. "And you're kinder than you pretend, Silas Boone." For the first time he didn't deny it. In the dead of winter, two lonely souls weathered the same storm, and when the snow finally settled, neither of them was the same. The mountain had gone quiet after the blizzard. Snow draped the trees like heavy quilts, muffling every sound except the slow drip of melting icicles and the crackle of firewood inside Silas Boone's cabin. For the first time since she arrived, Clara Mae felt something close to peace. She was kneading dough at the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, when Silas came in with his rifle slung across his shoulder. His coat was dusted white, but his eyes had softened in ways even he hadn't noticed. "Tracks by the ridge," he said, setting the rifle aside. "Too big for a fox. Might be a man." Clara looked up, startled. "A man? Out here?" He nodded slowly. "Don't like it much." Her hands stilled on the dough. "Could be lost. Could be trouble," he replied, voice low. "Ain't many come this far unless they mean to." She swallowed. "What'll you do?" He hesitated, then looked toward her. "What I always do. Keep my rifle close." The day passed heavy with tension. Silas went about his chores with quiet vigilance, scanning the treeline every few minutes. Clara tried to stay calm, but unease tugged at her. Just before dusk, as the sun bled red across the snow, it happened, a sound neither had expected to hear again in such a place. Knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. Silas's head snapped up. The air in the cabin thickened. Clara froze by the hearth, hands trembling. He reached for his rifle, cocked it, and nodded toward her to stay back. Then he opened the door just a crack. A blast of freezing air swept in, and with it, a man's hoarse voice. "Don't shoot, friend. Just need warmth. Been lost near a week." Silas studied him, a ragged figure half buried in snow, beard iced over, eyes sunken from hunger. He could have been telling the truth, or not. Still, Silas lowered the rifle just enough. "Come in." The man stumbled inside, dragging his pack behind him. He smelled of cold and desperation. Clara fetched a blanket without thinking and draped it around his shoulders. "Thank you, ma'am," he rasped, teeth chattering. "Name's Jonas Red. Been tracking the old trapper trails, lost my bearings after the storm." Silas watched him with eyes sharp as broken glass. "Traplines, huh? There's not been a trapper up this far all winter." Jonas looked down. "Guess that's why I got lost." The silence that followed could have cracked stone. Over supper, Clara tried to ease the tension. "Eat slow," she said kindly as the man shoveled stew into his mouth. "You'll make yourself sick." He smiled faintly, gratitude flickering across his gaunt face. "You're an angel, miss." "Truly." Silas didn't respond. He just watched, every movement, every glance, while pretending to whittle by the fire. When Jonas finally slept, Clara turned to Silas. "He's half-starved. You can't begrudge him a meal." Silas's jaw tightened. "Maybe. Or maybe he's just waitin' for night to do what men like him sometimes do." She frowned. "You don't know that. I know his kind." He looked toward the sleeping man, voice low. "Wolves ain't always on 4 legs." Clara sighed, pulling her shawl tighter. "You've lived too long in fear, Silas Boone. Not everyone's out to hurt you." He met her eyes, a storm behind his calm. "Out here you don't get second chances if you're wrong." But that night, as the wind moaned outside, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring into the firelight flickering against the log walls. The stranger's breathing came steady from the corner. Silas sat by the window, rifle resting across his knees, eyes never leaving the shadows. Hours passed. Then a faint creak. Silas moved like lightning. The rifle cocked, the barrel raised, pointed not at the door but at Jonas, who had risen quietly, knife in hand. "Put it down," Silas said, voice low and lethal. Jonas froze, knife half raised. His eyes darted between them, wild, cornered. "Please," Clara whispered, stepping forward. "Don't." But Silas didn't lower the gun. "I said put it down." Jonas hesitated, then dropped the knife to the floor. The clatter echoed like thunder. He fell to his knees, trembling. I wasn't gonna hurt you. Just wanted what's in the pack. Food, maybe some tobacco. I swear." Silas didn't blink. "And you figured stealing from me was easier than a skin dot." Jonas bowed his head. "I'm sorry." Clara moved between them, gently lowering Silas's rifle. "He's desperate, not evil." Silas's jaw worked. Desperation makes men dangerous. Then so does loneliness, she said softly, eyes meeting his. The tension in the room hung thick as the smoke curling from the fire. Finally, Silas exhaled, slow, steady, and lowered the rifle completely. Take what you need, he muttered to Jonas. Then you leave come daylight. Jonas nodded shakily, tears freezing on his cheeks. The next morning Clara packed him food, bread, jerky, and a flask of water. Jonas took it with trembling hands. Thank you, ma'am, he said, voice thick. Didn't deserve kindness, but you gave it anyway. Clara smiled faintly. The world's hard enough without us making it colder. He turned to Silas, hesitating. You're lucky, Boone. Not many get a woman like her. Then he disappeared into the white wilderness, leaving only his footprints behind. Silas watched him vanish over the ridge, then turned back toward the cabin. Clara was standing in the doorway, her hair loose, cheeks flushed from the cold. You didn't have to let him go, she said softly. Didn't have to stop me neither, he replied. They stood there for a long moment, snow falling gently around them, until finally he said, almost to himself, You were right, Clara Mae. Maybe not everyone's out to hurt us. She smiled, stepping closer. And maybe not everyone's meant to live alone. That night, when Silas sat by the fire carving wood again, he didn't choose the shape of a bird this time. He carved a woman, round, steady, kind-eyed, standing tall against a mountain. And when Clara passed behind him, humming softly, he paused just long enough to smile. For the first time in years, Silas Boone learned what it meant to trust again, and he had the stubborn, soft-hearted woman who refused to leave to thank for it. Winter clung stubbornly to Bear Valley. The days had grown longer, but the cold refused to leave. The pines still whispered secrets under their snowy cloaks, and the mountains loomed quiet and unblinking, ancient witnesses to the small lives beneath them. Inside the cabin, Clara Mae and Silas Boone worked in companionable silence. What had once been tense and awkward had softened into rhythm, a shared language built not from words, but from warmth, glances, and the creak of the rocking chair by the hearth. Clara was humming as she brushed flour from her hands. I'll start on the biscuits, she said, her voice bright. You want honey or butter with them tonight? Both, Silas grunted, not looking up from the bit of wood he was carving. But there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth, a rare sight that made her chest tighten with quiet joy. It had been weeks since the stranger Jonas left. Weeks since she'd seen that look of calm in Silas's eyes. But something still lingered in him, a weight that hadn't lifted, no matter how much laughter she coaxed from his rough edges. She'd seen it in the way he sometimes paused at the old photograph above the hearth, the one of a young woman holding a baby, both faces frozen in a time he never spoke of. Tonight that photograph seemed to stare at them both. As the biscuits baked, Clara went to stoke the fire. The flames flared high, catching on dry bark. For a moment, the warmth filled the cabin, until Silas suddenly rose and crossed the room, snatching a kettle from the hearth like it had burned him. You all right? She asked. Fine, he said quickly, too quickly. Fire just got too high. She tilted her head, studying him. You've got that look again. What look? The one that says you're thinking about ghosts. He froze, staring into the flames. For a long time he didn't answer. The only sound was the low crackle of burning wood. Then, in a voice low and rough as gravel, he said, You ever wonder why I live up here alone, Clara Mae? Her hands stilled. I figured a man gets tired of the world sometimes. He shook his head slowly. No. The world got tired of me. He sat down heavily, the firelight carving deep shadows across his face. She was my wife, he said, eyes fixed on the photograph. Martha. And the little one, that was our boy Jacob. Best thing I ever held in my arms. Clara moved closer, saying nothing. The winter 5 years back hit harder than any I'd seen. I went out hunting for meat and didn't make it back for 3 days. Snow cut me off. By the time I fought my way home, his voice cracked, barely a whisper. The fire'd gone out. So had they. Clara's heart broke in silence. He swallowed hard. Town folk said it was God's will. Said I shouldn't have been so far from home. But they didn't know how it feels to find your family frozen in your own house. He rubbed his scarred hands together, the motion shaking slightly. After that, I swore I'd never let another soul freeze because of me. Brought women up here hoping maybe I could make things right somehow, but every one of them saw what I was and ran. Can't blame 'em. He laughed bitterly, a sound that wasn't laughter at all. A monster they called me. A man cursed by the mountain. Clara reached across the table and laid her hand over his. Her touch was soft, sure, and steady. You're not cursed, Silas, she said gently. You're just hurt. He looked up then, eyes glassy with something he hadn't let himself feel in years. And you? You ain't afraid? Every woman before you left before the first thaw. She smiled faintly. Maybe they weren't built for the cold. But I've lived in it most my life, just a different kind. She paused, her voice lowering. I know what it means to be looked at like you're not worth staying for. His brow furrowed. Who'd look at you that way? Everyone back home, she said softly. Men didn't see me, Silas, not really. They saw my size, my shape, my silence. I was always too much for them to want and not enough to love. She gave a sad laugh. Figured I'd take a chance on a man who didn't want a woman for how she looked. Silas stared at her like she'd spoken something holy. You came here thinking I'd be kind? No, she said honestly. I came hoping I'd be needed. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. They sat in that glow, two broken souls bound by loss and loneliness. Finally, Silas spoke again, quieter now. You're the first person to sit and listen without flinching. You don't know what that means. She smiled softly. You'd be surprised how much I do know, Silas Boone. He met her gaze and for the first time he didn't look away. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and brushed a curl from her face. His hand lingered, rough thumb grazing her cheek. You're something else, Clara Mae, he murmured. Her heart thudded. Is that your way of saying thank you? He gave a small, crooked grin. It's my way of saying, I don't want you to leave. Her breath caught but she smiled. Then you'll just have to keep me warm through the next storm. He chuckled low, a real laugh this time, soft and unguarded, and the cabin suddenly felt warmer, brighter, alive again. That night, as the fire dimmed to glowing embers, Silas hung the photograph back above the hearth. But now, beside it, he set a new carving, one of Clara Mae, her hands steady and her face kind, standing before a small cabin carved with care. He didn't say a word about it. He didn't have to. Clara saw it in the morning light, and smiled through quiet tears. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in youth or beauty, but in the stillness after grief, when two souls too stubborn to give up find warmth in the ashes of their pain. The winter that had blanketed Bear Valley for months finally began to loosen its grip. Snow melted into silver streams that danced down the mountainside. The pine branches, heavy for so long, lifted their heads toward the sunlight as if waking from prayer. And in that quiet awakening, Silas Boone and Clara Mae began their new life, not as strangers bound by necessity, but as partners who had built something tender from the frost. Clara stood outside the cabin that morning, her cheeks pink with cold as she hung a blanket on the line. The wind smelled of pine sap and wet earth. She could hear Silas behind her, splitting wood, the rhythmic crack echoing against the valley walls. She turned and smiled. The mountain man who once glowered at every sound now whistled while he worked. When he noticed her watching, he grinned. What? Just never seen a man look that pleased to be choppin' wood, she teased. He leaned on his axe, smirking. Ain't the wood that pleases me, woman. It's knowin' someone's waitin' on the fire inside. Her face flushed warm. You say that like you mean it. He set the axe down and walked over, brushing sawdust from his hands. Reckon I do. Then softer, never thought I'd wake up wantin' to see someone's face every mornin' again. Her eyes glistened. And here I thought I was just keepin' you alive through winter. He chuckled. That too. But turns out you've been doin' more than that. By late afternoon, the snowmelt turned the trail into a river of mud. Clara laughed as she tried to cross to the barn, her boots sinking deep. You could lend a hand, you know? Silas appeared behind her, shaking his head, smiling. You'll never learn balance if I keep rescuing you. Oh, so now you're letting me drown? He grinned, and with one swift motion, lifted her clean off her feet. She squealed in surprise, clutching his shoulders. Silas Boone. You put me down this instant. Nope, he said, carrying her across the mud like she weighed nothing at all. Only place you're going is wherever I want you safe. When he set her down, her breath caught, not from the lift but from the look in his eyes. The fierce, gentle way he saw her, not as a burden, not as a pity, but as a woman who'd finally been chosen. For the first time in her life she didn't feel like she was too much, she felt enough. That night, they sat by the hearth, the last fire of the long winter glowing low in gold. Silas took something from his coat pocket, a small wooden ring carved smooth and shining. I ain't got gold or diamonds, he said quietly, but I made this for you. Figured if we made it through the storm, we ought to make it official. Clara's hand trembled as he slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Silas, she whispered, tears in her eyes, I don't need gold. I just need you. He leaned close, resting his forehead against hers. You already got me, Clara Mae Boone? Spring in the valley. When the first wagon from town made it up the mountain that spring, the driver blinked in shock. Rumor had it that the obese mail-order bride had fled before Christmas, or been eaten by wolves. But instead, there she stood, laughing beside her husband as they worked side by side, the cabin chimney puffing cheerfully behind them. The driver tipped his hat. Well, I'll be. Guess the mountain man finally found someone who could stand him. Clara just smiled, eyes twinkling. Oh, it ain't about standing him. It's about loving him. Silas wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. And I reckon the mountain's a little warmer now that she's here. When the wagon rolled back to town, it carried a new story, not of a beast and his runaway bride, but of a man and woman who built a home in the wild and proved that love wasn't just for the beautiful or the brave, it was for the willing. And up in Bear Valley, as wildflowers began to bloom where snow once lay thick, Clara Mae and Silas Boone stood hand in hand, watching the sun break over the mountains. Reckon we made it, she said softly. He squeezed her hand. No, Clara Mae. We're just beginning. Years later, travelers passing through Bear Valley would still talk of the cabin on the ridge, where smoke rose steady year after year and laughter echoed through the pines. They said the mountain man had finally found peace. But the truth was simpler. He had found her. And that, for both of them, was enough.